Turning points in the home front, 1942. In this section, we will look at how the home front of the United States was specifically changed during the war years, and also the major turning points of the war, the three major turning points. The poster that you see there is a portion of Rosie the Riveter, We Can Do It, which inspired women to work in the defense industry. The Battle of the Atlantic, 1941 to 1943. The failure of the German air attacks to knock Britain out of the war led to the Battle of the Atlantic. Between 1939 and 1944, the purpose was to use U-boats to sink ships and starve out Britain. Sink the Bismarck. The German battleship Bismarck broke out of the Baltic Sea and with its 14-inch guns sunk the pride of the British Royal Navy, the HMS Hood, 15 miles away. Only 2 men survived. It also damaged the HMS Prince of Wales. On the 24th of May of 1941, the Bismarck was now the terror of the Atlantic, and orders were given to sink it at all costs. Swordfish, biplanes from the carrier HMS Ark Royal, were able to damage the rudder, in which the Bismarck was now going in circles. British battleships would then come in, and heavy cruisers would intercept and cripple the ship on the morning of May 27th. After less than 2 hours of battle, shells and torpedoes reduced Bismarck to a wreck. She capsized and sunk, with a loss of all but 110 of her crew, of some 2,300 men. Hitler's reaction to Bismarck's loss produced a very cautious approach to future German surface ships operating against Britain's vital Atlantic sea lanes. The Sea Wolves. At sea, convoys protected British ships from submarine attacks. German submarines dominated the Atlantic in 1942. German Admiral Donitz plan was to create havoc with the U-boats called Sea Wolves since they attacked like a pack of wolves. The U-boat would sink a merchant ship in the convoy, and when the destroyers would break off from the escort and give chase, leaving the convoy defenseless, the rest of the U-boats would close in for the kill. A turning point in the Battle of the Atlantic came with the new sonar systems improving tracking of German U-boats, and the balance shifted when Allied ships attacked with depth charges. Operation Drumbeat. The entry of the United States in the war opened up the vast new hunting grounds for the German U-boat fleet. Operation Paukenschlag, Drumbeat in English, would begin in January of 1942 and brings the U-boats their easiest pickings of the war. Over 300 Allied vessels were sunk during Operation Drumbeat along the U.S. coastline, ranging from New York Harbor to the Straits of Florida. According to Dr. Michael Gannon of the University of Florida, the systematic assault by German submarines on merchant tankers and freighters along the U.S. eastern seaboard in 1942 constituted a greater strategic setback for the Allied war effort than did the defeat at Pearl Harbor. The case for the claim is intriguing, includes a damaging assessment of the U.S. Naval Command, which ignored information that might have allowed to avert the disaster. The exploits of U-123 and 28-year-old Lieutenant Commander Reinhard Hartigan, who sank 19 ships on 2 American patrols and twice received Germany's highest decoration, the Knight's Cross. On a personal note, I was told a story from my 9th grade English teacher, Mrs. Mary Jane Floyd, who was present at a USO dance and witnessed the sinking of an American oil tanker off Jacksonville Beach. Dr. Gannon's research with Hartigan discovered that the same scene, U-123, had hit the tank with torpedoes and surfaced to finish her off. Hartigan was in rough seas and was afraid of overshooting and hitting a party that he saw on the beach. So he ordered the U-boat to submerge and then reappear between the beach and the tanker and finish it off. The home front, USA organizing the economy. The support for the war unified America across regional, national, and class divisions. The War Manpower Commission, Congress authorized the President to reorganize the government for war. The War Manpower Commission allocated workers among vital industries in the military. The War Productions Board invested funds in new factories and managed war supply and contracts under Sears and Roebuck's director David Nelson. Henry Stimpson, a Republican was the new Secretary of War, convinced the president industry convert their consumer goods to defense production, applying mass production techniques to aircraft production. While most defense contracts went to establish industrial states, the South and West also benefited greatly. The arsenal of democracy. At first, the president wanted to have a number of regulations on industry with war contracts. He was convinced by David Nelson when he told the president, allow American industry to make a profit without all the constraints and watch what will happen. War production in the United States, existing factories were very effective in retooling for producing war materials. American industry produced a staggering 40% of all the war materials in the world, two-thirds for the Allied war effort, 297,000 aircraft, 193,000 pieces of artillery, 86,000 tanks, 2 million army trucks. The Great Depression was ended because of the upturn in the wartime economy. General Motors Corporation supplied 1/10 of all American war production. Willow Run. Henry Ford was given the contract for designing and building Willow Run, a factory with a 1-mile assembly line, which in the end would produce one B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. Ford would go on to produce more equipment for the Army than Italy would. In the Kaiser shipyards, they were able to reduce the number of man hours and the time it took to build a Liberty ship from 355 days to 8 days by using Henry Ford's assembly line technique. The Office of Price Management fought inflation by implementing price controls and rationing. Rationing was a fixed allotment of goods needed for the military. Households received ration books with coupons such as gasoline. Gas rationing was very hard in the western states. Items also included coffee, sugar, butter, meats, cheese, canned foods, shoes, and tires. Americans didn't mind the sacrifice. The black market did occur, buying at inflated prices. With frozen wages, prices, and rents, and with less to spend, government encouraged people to buy war bonds to control inflation. Propaganda. American propaganda during the war, the government was successful at soliciting participation in scrap drives. The Tokyo Kid that you see to the right was a racist display of characterizing Japanese with large glasses and rat-like features, buck-teeth fangs. Fictional radio character Hop Harrigan fought the Axis powers in their shows. The federal government tried to maintain war support through drives and campaigns and managing the war news. Censorship was uneven. The Office of War Information enlisted Hollywood to produce films supporting the war. The most successful war movies dramatized the courage of the Allies, like Casablanca, The Great Dictator, A Yank in the RAF, The Flying Tigers, and Guadalcanal Diary. Ethnic minorities in the war effort. Mexican Americans. In order to meet the wartime demands for their crops, Southern farmers began to recruit Hispanic workers from Mexico at harvest time. This was known as the Braceros program. The growth of the Mexican Americans in Los Angeles and increased racial tensions in the city prompted a week-long riot known as the Zoot Suit Riot, after the popular suits of the time. Native Americans were a key labor force for military supply depots, and many stayed in cities when the war had ended. African Americans. The Double V campaign was an attempt by civil rights leaders to promote democracy at home as well as abroad. In it, African Americans tried to demonstrate the irony of Americans fighting against racial bigotry in Nazi Germany and the other Axis countries while upholding racism and discrimination inside the United States. A. Philip Randolph and his Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters negotiated with FDR an executive order ending racial discrimination in the defense industry, hiring in exchange for cancellation of their march on Washington, D.C. in 1941. The Fair Employment Practice Committee, the federal agency established in 1941 to curb racial discrimination in war production, jobs, and government employment. FDR's issuance of the Executive Order 8802 banned racial discrimination in employment for defense industries. The migration caused by the war crossed traditional, regional, and racial boundaries. African American migration out of the South accelerated as migrants went to the northern and western cities, hoping to find better economic opportunity and less racism. Economic opportunity was available, but racism still existed. Racial tensions erupted in violence in 50 cities in 1943 alone. Women during the war. Employment of women increased enormously during the war years. With millions of men enlisting in the military, over 8 million women found themselves open to opportunities that previously had been closed. Women became tool makers, lumberjacks, blacksmiths, and so on as valuable members of the civilian workforce that helped produce the goods needed to fight the war. Of 6 million women employed, 75% were married and over the age of 35 with children. Women were encouraged to work by poster images of strong, handsome women. The U.S. government developed the image of Rosie the Riveter to encourage women to take over production jobs. The 1942 poster shows a woman worker with a polka dot bandana associated with Rosie, and it equates the bandana with the hats worn by Wax, Waves, and other women in the armed services. Women played vital roles in the shipyards and the aircraft industry. Many men and women married as economic times improved, and the war intensified romances. Married women often followed their husbands to various military posts. Latchkey children of working mothers were left to fend for themselves. Children also participated in various war drives and campaigns. Men and women in the military. In 1939, the U.S. military had 334,000 soldiers, sailors, and Marines, the 18th largest military in the world. In 1945, the number had reached 11 million in the Army and Army Air Forces and 3.4 million in the Navy and Marines. By 1945, 5 million volunteered for active duty. The selected service system would help meet the U.S. manpower needs, providing 10 million more. Called GIs because everything was government issue, so they started calling themselves government issue or GIs. Army Chief of Staff General George C. Marshall pushed for a Women's Auxiliary Corps, known as WACS, and around 350,000 women enlisted in the armed forces. In the WACS, and the women also accepted for volunteer emergency services, the WAVES, the Navy component, and equivalent groups for women in the Marine Corps. Coast Guard and Air Force women served as nurses and members of the WACS, WAVES, SPARS, and the Marine Corps Women's Reserve. The civilian auxiliary of the Air Force used women pilots to ferry aircraft across the nation, known as WASPs. African Americans serving in the military. About 1 million African Americans served in the military in segregated units. They often encountered discrimination on and off the military bases since they were located in the South. General Benjamin Davis Jr., the man you see to the right, was only the fourth African American to graduate from West Point. During the war, the airmen commanded by Davis compiled an outstanding record in combat against the Luftwaffe. They flew more than 15,000 sorties, shot down 112 enemy planes, destroyed or damaged 273 on the ground at a cost of 66 of their own planes, and losing only about 25 bombers, and won more than 850 medals. Some military leaders, including Eisenhower, suggested changes to the U.S. military policies regarding racial discrimination, partly in response to the need more combat troops. Many African American servicemen distinguished themselves during the war. Fifth Army held the beachhead against the Nazis. General Patton said of the African American tankers that were sent to him, "Men, you're the first Negro tankers ever to fight in the American Army. I would never have asked for you if you weren't good. I have nothing but the best in my army. I don't care what color you are, so as long as you go up there and kill those Kraut sons of a bitches." Native Americans. 25,000 Native Americans served in the armed forces, including the famous Navajo code talkers. Because Navajo is a complex grammar, it is not mutually intelligible. At the time, it was still an unwritten language. Its complex syntax and phonology, not to mention its numerous dialects, made it unintelligible to anyone without extensive exposure and training. One estimated indicated that at the outbreak of World War II, fewer than 30 non-Navajo could understand the language. Joe Medicine Crow, the man you see pictured to the right, completed all 4 tasks required to become a warrior chief: touching an enemy without killing him, taking an enemy's weapon, leading a successful war party, and stealing an enemy's horse. He touched a living enemy soldier, a German, and disarmed him, after turning a corner and finding himself face to face with the young German soldier. The collision knocked the German's weapon to the ground. Crow then lowered his own weapon, and the two fought hand to hand. In the end, Crow got the best of the German, grabbing him by the neck and choking him. He was going to kill the German soldier, he said on the spot, when the man screamed out, "Mama!" Crow then let him go. He also led a successful war party and stole 50 horses owned by the Nazi SS from a German camp, singing a traditional Crow honor song as he rode off. Medicine Crow is the last member of the Crow tribe to become a war chief. Internment of Japanese Americans. Executive Order 9066 on February 29, 1942 was issued. To counter fears of a Japanese invasion, FDR authorized EO 9066, removing Japanese Americans from the Pacific Coast states. On March 18th, the War Relocation Authority was created for the purpose of interning all West Coast Japanese Americans, 112,000 that were born in Japan, and 100,000 Nisi. Nisi were Japanese Americans that were a second generation, born in the United States. Therefore, they were U.S. citizens. The state of Hawaii was treated very leniently and yet had the majority of percentage of Japanese Americans living there. In Supreme Court cases, Hirabashi versus the United States on June 21, 1943, the Supreme Court unanimously upheld ethnic internment by not considering the issue of Japanese exclusion from the West Coast, citing the authority to wage war successfully. In Korematsu versus the United States on 18 December 1944, the Supreme Court voted 6-3 to uphold the exclusion of Japanese from the West Coast, a military decision because the U.S. was at war with Japan. It should also be noted that approximately 11,000 German Americans and German nationals and fewer than 2,000 Italian Americans and Italian nationals were also in internment camps. April 1942, air attack on Japan launched from the carrier Hornet and led by Lieutenant Colonel James H. Doolittle was the most daring operation yet undertaken by the United States in the young Pacific War. Though convinced as a diversion that would also boost American and Allied morale, the raid generated strategic benefits that far outweighed its limited goals. The B-25B Mitchell medium bomber was selected as the delivery vehicle, and tests showed that it could fly off the carrier with a useful bomb load, enough fuel to hit Japan and continue on to the airfields in China. Most of the 16 B-25s, each with a 5-man crew, attacked the Tokyo area. Damage to the intended military targets was modest, and none of the planes reached the Chinese airfields, though all but few of their crew survived. However, the Japanese high command was deeply embarrassed. 3 of the 8 American airmen that were captured were executed. The Philippine Islands, December 7, 1941 through May 10, 1942. Thailand surrendered, followed by Guam, Wake Island on December 23rd, the Gilbert Islands, Hong Kong on December 26th, British Malaya and its capital in Singapore from February 21st through March 1st, 1942. Allies were defeated in the Dutch East Indies, including the island of Java. On March 11th, General Douglas MacArthur secretly left the Philippines for Australia after establishing headquarters on the Bataan Peninsula of the Fortress of Corregidor in Manila Bay. On May 7th, U.S. forces surrendered Corregidor, while 75,000 Filipino and U.S. troops surrendered on the Bataan Peninsula. MacArthur was named Supreme Allied Commander in the Pacific, and in Australia vowed that I shall return. He was awarded the Medal of Honor for escaping from the Philippines. The Bataan Death March. During the battle for the Philippines on April 3, 1942, after 3 months of siege, the Japanese 14th Army, led by General Mashima Homma, defeated U.S. Filipino forces, leading to the surrender by U.S. Major General Edward P. King. The Japanese planned the march in order to move 78,000 prisoners from the southern Bataan Peninsula, removing them from the theater of operations in preparation for the siege of Corregidor. The Japanese failed to supply the prisoners with food or water until they reached Bologna. Many of the prisoners died along the way of heat or exhaustion. Prisoners were given no food for the first 3 days and were only allowed to drink water from filthy water buffalo wallows on the side of the road. They were starved and mistreated, often kicked or beaten along the way, and many of them fell or were bayoneted. Only 54,000 reached the camp. 7 to 10,000 died along the way, and the rest escaped into the jungle. One of the survivors was Mats Tinelli. Tinelli was coached by Elmer Layden, one of the famous four horsemen at the University of Notre Dame. He was a star there, scoring the game-winning touchdowns against Southern California, the college where he originally wanted to go, and helped to lead the Fighting Irish to a national ranking. The Chicago Cardinals would sign him from the NFL, and he made between $3,000 and $7,000 a year. And then he signed a 3-year contract in 1941, with the war just around the corner. He signed up for the Army because he knew he'd be drafted sooner or later and wanted to get his 1-year requirement out of the way. Tinelli was then stationed at Clark Airfield in the Philippines, the biggest air base in the Pacific. When Pearl Harbor was bombed, and the Japanese bombed Clark Field, his world would change forever. According to Tinelli, on the first day of the march, a Japanese guard demanded Mott's Notre Dame class ring. Later, a Japanese army officer took the ring from the guard and recognized the name inscribed on it. When Tinelli asked, "How do you know who I am?" the Japanese officer replied, "I was a student at USC and watched you score the winning touchdown. You need to hide this ring where no one will find it." He then survived a 60-mile march in the hands of his captors while many around him died. He would say, quote, "For 7 days we didn't have any water. If you went to the stream to drink, they would shoot you. Bodies were all over the place. If you didn't go on, you'd be shot or bayoneted." End quote. He also remembers marching towards a human head on the pole with bugs and flies all over it. He remembers heads cut off by Japanese aggressors. He remembers people fighting to keep up with the pace so they would not be killed. He would say, "In the first camp, we were burying 20 to 30 guys a day. You could smell the dysentery everywhere. I can still smell it today." He also remembers having to do push-ups over the tree until he fell in. He remembers being fed 1 ball of rice 3 times a day for each meal. And he remembers starvation, exhaustion, and disease. He was about to give up when he was given his prison ID number, which was the same number he wore at the University of Notre Dame. When Tinelli entered the Second World War, he weighed 210 pounds. When he left and was liberated from Allied forces from a Japanese prisoner of war camp, he weighed 80 pounds and was sick with disease. The Battle of Coral Sea. The Japanese planned to take Australia and strike at Japan again. From May 4th to 8th, the Battle of Coral Sea was the first naval engagement in world history where no surface vessels met in combat. No ships, fighting ships, and all combat was done by carrier-based airplanes. Japan's southward advance towards Australia was halted and turned back from Port Moresby, New Guinea. The U.S. lost the carrier, the USS Lexington, you see pictured there, and the USS Yorktown was severely damaged. The nearest repair facility was at Pearl Harbor, almost 5,000 miles away. Japan only lost 1 light carrier and suffered damage. But this was the first check on Japanese aggression. They came at the Battle of Coral Sea. Turning points of war. There'll be three major turning points in the war that would change the course of war in favor of the Allies. The first is the Battle of Midway, June 4th through 6th, 1942. Yamamoto, intended to surprise, was thwarted by the superior American communications intelligence, which deduced his scheme well before the battle was joined. This allowed Admiral Chester Nimitz, the U.S. fleet commander, to establish an ambush by having his carriers ready and waiting for the Japanese. June 4th, 1942. In the second of the Pacific War's great carrier battles, the trap was sprung. The perseverance, sacrifice, and skill of U.S. Navy aviators, plus a great deal of luck on the American side. The Japanese first struck Midway Islands and had no knowledge where the U.S. Pacific Fleet was located. VB-6 and VS-6 Dauntless bombers from the Enterprise bombed and fatally damaged carriers Kaga and Akagi, while VB-3 Dauntless from Yorktown, which arrived from Coral Sea and was quickly repaired, bombed and wrecked the carrier Soryu, while the Japanese planes were changing the bombs on the deck. At 11 o'clock, one Japanese carrier that escaped destruction that morning, Hiru, launched Val dive bombers that temporarily disabled Yorktown around noon. 3.5 hours later, Hiru's Kate torpedo planes struck a second blow, forcing Yorktown's abandonment. In return, Dauntless from Enterprise mortally damaged Hiru in a strike around 1700 that afternoon. The destruction of the carrier strike force compelled Admiral Yamamoto to abandon his Midway invasion plans, and the Japanese fleet began to retire westward. The base at Midway, though damaged by the Japanese air attack, remained operational, later became a vital component in the American Trans-Pacific offensive. The U.S. only lost 2 ships, including the carrier Yorktown, and 300 men, while Japan lost 4 carriers, 275 planes, and most of their experienced pilots, and 4,800 men, and its naval superiority after the Pearl Harbor was the damage. This was the turning point of the war in the Pacific. The Battle of El Alamein. The Desert Fox, General Erwin Rommel, the man you see pictured in the upper right, was sent with his Africa Corps to reinforce the Italians who were losing to the British. Rommel would push the British to the border of Egypt, and Rommel's craftiness earned him the nickname Desert Fox. The war in the desert in North Africa was pivotal. If the Africa Corps got to the Suez Canal, the availability of the Allies to supply themselves would be severely dented. The psychology blow of losing the Suez and losing in North Africa would have been incalculable, especially as this would have given Germany near enough free access to all the oil in the Mid-East which they needed. Rommel's army had driven to El Alamein, where General Bernard Montgomery, Monty, took command of the British Eighth Army. The Battle of El Alamein is usually divided into 5 phases, consisting of breaking in October 23rd to the 24th, the crumbling of 24th to 25th of October, the counter of 26th to 28th October, and Operation Surcharge 1st to the 2nd November, and the final breakout of 3rd and 7th November. On 8th of November, Erwin Rommel learned of an Allied invasion of Morocco and Algeria that was under the command of General Dwight David Eisenhower. His depleted army now faced a war on 2 fronts, and so he retreated. Winston Churchill was convinced that the Battle of Alamein marked the turning point in the war and ordered the ringing of church bells all over Britain. As he would later say, before Alamein, we never had a victory. After Alamein, we never had a defeat. As mentioned earlier, Operation Torch, November 8, 1942, was the first Allied amphibious operation with General Dwight Eisenhower, who landed at Oran Casablanca in Algiers, North Africa. Operation Torch signaled U.S. entry into the European ground war. British-American troops first fought Vichy French forces, who offered little resistance. At the Battle of Kasserine Pass in February 1943, was the first major engagement between the United States and Axis forces in Africa. Inexperienced and poorly trained led American troops suffered many casualties and were quickly pushed back over 50 miles. Major General George S. Patton Jr. would replace Major General Lloyd Fredendall and was relieved by Eisenhower and sent home. Patton quickly would discipline the army after capturing Pass and would be given a nickname by his troops, Old Blood and Guts. Our blood, his guts. The third and final turning point was the Battle of Stalingrad. Stalingrad was a major industrial city on the banks of the Volga River, a vital transport route between the Caspian Sea and northern Russia. The region in the Caucasus, with its large oil fields, which were needed for the German army. Capturing the city would be a major ideological and propaganda coup. The city was named after Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union. The battle began on August 23, 1942, and by September 1942, the German commander of the Sixth Army, General Paulus, assisted by the Fourth Panzer Army, advanced in the city of Stalingrad. Stalin's order was not a step backwards. The Luftwaffe would leave the city in rubble, as you could see to the left. And by November, the German army had captured 9/10 of the city. The last part of the city was on the other side of the Volga River. But snipers were very effective, such as Vasily Zaitsev that you see in the middle. In but 10 days' time, he nearly killed 40 Germans, and SS Colonel Heinz Thorwald was dispatched to Stalingrad for the sole purpose to kill him. Thorwald was in charge of the sniper school for the SS. However, Zaitsev would kill Heinz. In Operation Uranus, on November 8, 19, the Russians were in a position whereby they could launch a counteroffensive, and the Red Army launched it, a two-pronged attack targeting the weak Romanian and Hungarian troops, which were protecting the Sixth Army's flank. Marshal Zhukov's Sixth Armies of 1 million men surrounded the city. The bulk of Sixth Army, some 250,000 and 300,000 men, was in the city, and Zhukov, having used his resources to go around the city north and south, had trapped the Germans at Stalingrad. By January 30th, 1943, Hitler promoted Paulus to General Field Marshal, since no German field marshal had ever been taken prisoner. Hitler assumed that Paulus would fight on or take his own life. However, when the Soviet forces closed on his headquarters at the ruined Gum department store, the next day Paulus would surrender. Only 91,000 Germans were left of the 330,000. Of those 91,000, less than 10,000 would survive the prisoner of war camps in the Soviet Union. The Soviets lost 1.2 million soldiers and civilians dead, but it was the turning point of the war in Europe.